Hey everyone, Amtrak Guy 365 here, and today on this first episode of Engines of York Central, I'll be talking about the railroad's Hudson locomotives. Before I begin though, I'm very sorry about this video taking literal years to happen. I announced this series with the original ending of Engines of Amtrak back in August of 2018 with the original Acela episode. But then for some reason I just never got around to Engines of York Central, I don't know why. But anyway, it's finally here, so let's get right into it. Throughout the 1920s, American railroads like the New York Central were quite busy. The railroad had plenty of passengers and freight to move, but this was also proving to be too strenuous on the railroad's existing fleet of locomotives. The Central's primary passenger power were 462 K Class Pacific engines. These could manage anything from freight to commuter passenger runs and even premier passenger trains like the 20th Century Limited. The Pacifics could manage around 12 passenger cars at most, averaging around 50 miles an hour. But with increasing passenger numbers and company interests in speed, New York Central would need an all-new locomotive to power their passenger trains. Due to the railroad's axle load limits, they couldn't make their Pacifics any larger and would need a whole new design to support a bigger boiler. This would ultimately result in the first 464 steam locomotive built in the United States in 1927. This was numbered 5200 and classified as a J1. Paul Kiefer was the new chief mechanical engineer of motive power and rolling stock on the New York Central and led the experimental 464 project. The design was based and inspired on the railroad's existing fleet of K5 Pacifics in terms of their appearance. The 464 was also inspired by the then relatively new Lima-built 284 Berkshire design and their larger firebox, resulting from the four-wheel trailing truck. A larger firebox meant more continuous steaming power, referred to as superpower at the time, and larger steam production meant more pulling power. J1 5200 was delivered from the American Locomotive Works, or ALCO, on February 14, 1927, and was subjected to thorough tests on the main line between Albany and Syracuse, New York. The tests were proving positive, the Hudson being able to manage 16 to 18 heavyweight passenger cars compared to the 12 of a Pacific type. The New York Central deemed the locomotive a keeper. However, this new engine type needed a name. Paul Kiefer asked company president Pat Crowley what to name the 464. Crowley said, "Let's call her the Hudson, after the Hudson River." With that, the name was settled for what would become one of America's most iconic locomotives. Crowley chose this name as from his desk, he had a view of the Hudson River. The railroad's main line, the water level route, also ran next to the Hudson River. As for technical specifications, the New York Central J1s were a 464 locomotive, 4 wheels up front, 6 driving wheels, and 4 trailing wheels. They were rated for a top speed of 110 miles per hour with 79-inch drivers, producing 41,860 pounds of tractive effort. They weighed in at 681,900 pounds. They came in at a length of 97 feet 2 3/8 inches, a width of 10 feet 6 inches, and a height of 15 feet 1 inch. The locomotives came equipped with a Nathan 6-chime step-top whistle. Here's a sample. 205 J1 Hudsons would be built and delivered to the New York Central from 1927 up into 1931, being numbered 5200 to 5344. They were quickly put to work on cracked trains like the 20th Century Limited and other passenger services. While these were the first Hudsons on American rails, they weren't the first 464s ever designed in the US or North America. The Milwaukee Road had designed a 464 Baltic type in 1925, but due to financial constraints, the design wasn't put to rails until 1930, 3 years after the Central. Even older than that, though, was the Grand Trunk Railway's 464T X10A tank engine built for commuter service around Montreal, Quebec, and Canada. Meanwhile, railroads that were tied to the New York Central, like the Michigan Central and Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis Railway, or simply the Big Four, ordered their own set of 30 J1 Hudsons each. These railroads would be fully incorporated into the Central in 1930, along with their Hudson engines. New York Central subsidiary Boston and Albany ordered 20 Hudsons known as the J2 and were delivered from 1928 to 1931. The J2s had 75-inch drivers instead of the standard 79, were a little bit heavier, and had smaller tenders. Some also had a green boiler jacket and gray smokebox. The Boston and Albany would eventually be fully incorporated into the Central as well. Around this time, throughout the mid to late 1930s, streamlining was starting to take hold as part of the Art Deco movement, especially on railroads. The Union Pacific had been bringing its new M10000 diesel streamliner on tour across the US beginning in February 1934, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad made a name for itself in May of that year with its equally new Pioneer Zephyr diesel streamliner. In February 1934, the Central's Equipment Engineering Department staffer, Carl F. Cantola, designed a new streamlined shroud for a Hudson. In December, J1E Hudson number 5344, which was the newest and last to be delivered, was at the West Albany shops and given the streamlining treatment. The engine became America's first streamlined steam locomotive, had its number removed, and was given the name Commodore Vanderbilt, named after the notable Cornelius Vanderbilt and his aforementioned nickname, who was one of the Central's former early leaders. The engine was nicknamed the Upside Down Bathtub and went on a publicity tour to big cities on the New York Central system. Back to the standard Hudsons though, they would see their last new variant in the form of 50 J3s in 1937 and 38. The J3s had 20% more power than the J1s at 65 miles per hour, and they could produce 4,700 horsepower at 77 miles per hour. The engines could run around 185,000 to 200,000 miles before needing heavy repairs, which was equivalent to about 2 years of service. Some of these engines were equipped with much larger centipede tenders, allowing for more coal and water storage, and were nicknamed Super Hudsons. The last 10 J3s, number 5544 to 5454, were given streamlining by industrial designer Henry Dreyfuss in 1938. Dreyfuss had worked with the Central in designing the streamlined 462 Mercury locomotive in its train in 1936. The Dreyfuss Hudsons came with a redesign of the 20th Century Limited with brand new lightweight equipment as well. These were designed in an Art Deco style with 79-inch skull and disc drivers and a blue, gray, and white color scheme. The locomotive was sleek with a rounded out nose and a front end reminiscent of a Spartan helmet. The tender and coaches had a long stripe band along the entire consist as well. The streamlined J3s could race the near 20-car train up to 90 miles per hour along the water level route with ease. J1 number 5344, the Commodore Vanderbilt, would receive the Dreyfuss streamlining job in 1939 and was used on the Mercury train. This made the engine the first steam locomotive to be streamlined twice. Another streamlining design would be used for the Empire State Express in December 1941, instead using a two-tone white and black color scheme with stainless steel passenger cars. J3As number 5426 and 5429 would receive this treatment. Throughout the late 1930s and into the early 1940s, the New York Central's J Class Hudsons would continue speeding passenger trains up and down the railroad's iconic system. They would often be featured in advertising or public relations material as well. While they performed great on level and straight track bed at high speeds, the Hudsons weren't so great at low speeds or on gradients. Meanwhile though, the idea of more modern power, namely dieselization, came quickly. New York Central began developing new dual-service 482 Mohawk engines, and EMD E-Series diesels had replaced steam on the 20th Century Limited in 1945. In 1944, after receiving permission from the War Production Board, the Central began building new 484 Niagara locomotives. These combined the benefits of the Mohawks and Hudsons and took inspiration from other railroads who had already adopted 484s. The Niagaras went into service starting in 1945 and took the helm of heavy passenger trains. The Hudsons remained in service, but engines like 5344 would lose their streamlining, yet kept their disc drivers. They continued pulling passenger trains, but again, dieselization was on the horizon moving into the 1950s. The New York Central would dieselize by 1957, with some Hudsons surviving into service up until around 1956 and 57. Afterwards though, like many other steam engines, they would be sent to various yards to be cut up for scrap. Strangely, the Central didn't preserve a single Hudson despite their popularity and iconic design. The mighty Hudsons were now reduced to scrap metal after a famous career being the railroad's flagship locomotive. However, there is somewhat of a silver lining. Back in 1948, J1 Hudsons number 5311 and 5313 were sold to the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo Railway of Southern Ontario in Canada. The TH&B dieselized in 1954, and the two Hudsons were promptly scrapped, but 5313's tender was converted into a steam generator for passenger trains. Much later in the summer of 2002, it was sent to Steamtown National Historic Site in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where it remains today as the sole remaining piece of a New York Central Hudson. The legacy of the New York Central's Hudson locomotives proved quite impactful. Lionel used J1 number 5344 as the basis for its famous 700E O-gauge model of the Hudson beginning in 1937, being the first mass-produced model train. The Hudsons also saw use on music album covers, animated media, and it remains a fan favorite amongst rail fans. In my personal opinion, if I think of an iconic or typical steam locomotive in my head, I imagine one of the Central's unstreamlined Hudsons. I think it just epitomizes what a steam locomotive is meant to look like. Regardless though, the Hudsons sure enough left their mark on what was the New York Central system, the road to the future. Thanks for watching this first episode of Engines of New York Central. Sorry again that it took 3 years to make, but I still hope you enjoyed it.
After 3 years in development, hopefully it will have been worth the wait.
I'll likely be alternating between Engines of Amtrak and Engines of New York Central, so the next Engines of video will be the remake of the Amtrak Metroliner episode. Then after that, I'll do an episode on the Mohawk engines for New York Central. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know what you thought of this first episode, and thank you again for watching.